On September 1st, 2018 at around 9 p.m., Amelia Fialho, a respected 59-year-old teacher, disappeared without a trace. For the community and her colleagues at the school, Amelia's absence was the beginning of an agonizing search. A rather brief search, to be honest, but one that would end up deeply affecting everyone involved. What nobody knew yet was that this disappearance wasn't really a disappearance, right? And that the teacher's body would be found days later, burned in a field dozens of kilometers from her home, discovered almost by chance by the owner of a farm. Today's story takes us to Portugal, specifically to the Montijo area, a predominantly residential and quiet city located in the district of Setúbal, right in the metropolitan area of Lisbon. The exact date was Saturday, September 1st, 2018. In this area lived Amelia Fialho, a 59-year-old woman who worked as a physics and chemistry teacher at Jorge Peixin High School. Amelia was a very well-known and respected person in her community, and she was also admired by her colleagues at work. She was a very hard-working woman. She was dedicated. And although she had never married or had biological children, she had adopted a girl named Diana Rodriguez several years ago, who from that moment on was called Diana Fialho, and who became her adopted daughter. 2 days after her disappearance, Diana, her daughter, made a post on Facebook. In that message, Diana said that her mother had disappeared, that she was last seen on the night of September 1st at dinner time, which was when she said she was going out. Yes, the mother said she was going out. That was the last time they saw her. From that moment on, nobody knew anything about her, and her phone was already turned off, so they had no other way to contact her. And in this post, she asked that anyone with information contact the family or the police, clarifying that they had already filed the formal missing person report with the PSP. Diana was also interviewed by a television channel where she appeared very worried about her mother and stated that it was not normal for her to disappear in that way. She said that after her post on Facebook, many people had written to her suggesting the possibility that someone had kidnapped her and left her abandoned somewhere. When she was asked if her mother had any enemies or someone who might possibly want to harm her, she said no, everyone loved her very much. This young woman said that on that Saturday night she only heard the door of the house open and close. So she didn't see her mom, she just heard the sound of the door. And that the next day, she found her mother's car keys on the table. That's why she assumed Amelia had gone out on foot, maybe to see someone she knew, and at the time she didn't think much of it. She didn't even realize that her mother hadn't come back home to sleep. It wasn't until Sunday at lunchtime that she started to get worried. Amelia always went to church on Sunday mornings, so she assumed that's why she hadn't seen her that morning. But since she never came back for lunch, that's when she tried calling her over and over again, but the phone seemed to be turned off. At first, her friends and acquaintances thought that maybe Amelia had gone on a trip without telling anyone. Still, it was strange, but there was one detail that didn't fit. She had left her dog at home. And everyone knew that Amelia never went anywhere without her. The concern began to grow noticeably. Those close to Amelia got in touch with the school where she worked, hoping that something unexpected had come up or there had been a last-minute transfer. But they didn't know anything about her either. Amelia loved her job as a teacher. For her to be absent, especially during those specific dates, was even more unusual. Because it was the beginning of the school year. That didn't reassure those who knew her either. The search quickly extended to local hospitals to check if the teacher had been admitted under her name, but no one had any records of her. Faced with desperation and a lack of answers, the decision was made to print and distribute flyers with her photo, and they distributed them on different streets. But this also didn't yield any positive results. Although initially the daughter filed a formal missing person report with the police. The strange circumstances of the case caused the investigation to take a different direction. the judicial police took responsibility for this case file. The inspectors in charge knew perfectly well that to solve the mystery of the teacher, they had to start putting together a puzzle, whose initial pieces were already pointing to a scenario much darker than anyone in the community could have imagined. According to Diana's own account, her mother's car hadn't even moved. It was still at home, with the keys on the table, which reinforced the idea that Amelia had left on foot. Amelia's cell phone, on the other hand, remained completely turned off, and the initial tracking attempts didn't yield any clear coordinates. The police began to discreetly question those closest to her. Diana, the daughter, maintained her version that Amelia had left the house on her own, on foot, and never came back. Without a body, without the phone, and without any physical evidence, the investigators still had nothing concrete about what might have happened to the teacher. That changed on Wednesday, September 5th, about 40 kilometers away from Montijo, in a rural and deserted area of Pegoes. A heartbreaking discovery was made. A man named Nuno Casero, the owner of a piece of farmland in the Pegoes area, went to inspect his land accompanied by officers from the Republican National Guard of Caña. The reason for the visit was to assess the damage from a small grass fire that the local firefighters had put out the previous morning, and that fire drew attention. Casero had been approached by the officers to confirm whether he had started the fire in that area. And that's because, due to the extremely high risk of forest fires, starting any kind of fire or carrying out agricultural burns is considered a serious crime. Casero, however, claimed to have no knowledge of what had happened. This man and the officers went to check what had happened there. And as they entered the property and inspected an area of burned brush, the authorities' flashlights came across the remains of a completely charred human body. The body was unrecognizable. The officers couldn't even determine the gender or age of the victim at that first moment. To achieve a reliable identification, the forensic team had to work against the clock, using DNA tests and rapid genetic profile matching. Hours later, forensic science confirmed that the remains belonged to Amelia Fialho. To better understand Amelia's private life and the world around her, we need to go inside the family home. Amelia Fialho was a woman whose life seemed professionally fulfilled, but in her personal life she carried a deep desire for years, the longing to become a mother. As I mentioned before, Amelia had never married or had biological children, so her path to becoming a mother was to adopt and take in a girl named Diana Rodriguez in 2004. We mentioned at the beginning that she was only 9 years old at the time, and by 2018 she was already 23. Those who knew both women agreed that their relationship deteriorated over time. It was no secret for anyone, because even the neighbors could hear their arguments from the street. And while Amelia loved and cared for Diana as her own daughter, because she was her daughter, something happened that strained their relationship. It all seems to have started when Diana started college to study mathematics and met a guy named Yuri Mata. People close to them agree that the problems in that house became constant after that relationship started. Diana lived with her mother until she was 18, and at that point she decided to go live with Yuri. First, they went to his mother's house, meaning they lived at his mother's house, and then they moved to his grandmother's place. A couple of years before the crime happened, Amelia had agreed to let her daughter move back home, but Diana set one condition, which was that Yuri could also move in with them. That's how the son-in-law ended up moving into the same house as the teacher. The couple got married on July 12, 2018, just 2 months before Amelia disappeared. And by then, Diana was 23 years old and Yuri was 27. Yuri was considered a kind, polite, and diligent young man. He had a degree in accounting, but he was unemployed, and like his wife, he didn't show much interest in looking for a job. Diana also struggled to make progress with her studies in mathematics, and by 2018, neither of them was earning any income. Both of them depended completely and entirely on Amelia's salary and assets to live. The neighbors in the area and people close to the family had already started to notice that things at home were not going well, according to testimonies collected later. During the last few years, living together had become unbearable. There was obvious friction in their daily lives, mainly caused by the financial demands of the two younger adults. Diana and her husband constantly demanded that Amelia pay them a fixed allowance, a monthly sum of money to cover all their expenses and whims, despite being two adults perfectly capable of joining the workforce. Meanwhile, Amelia was understandably reluctant to give them money. She didn't deny them a roof over their heads. She didn't deny them food, but she didn't agree to give them everything they asked for. This financial pressure soon crossed the line into psychological abuse, escalating to levels of physical violence. One of the people who witnessed this decline most closely was Maria Sousa, a colleague at the same high school and one of Amelia's closest friends. Maria recounted that in the months leading up to September 2018, Amelia was no longer the same as before. Her cheerful demeanor had completely disappeared. On several occasions, the teacher arrived at school with visible signs of physical abuse, showing bruises on her skin as well as having teary eyes. When her colleague asked her in private what had happened to Amelia, she confessed with evident fear that those marks were the direct result of the serious altercations she had had with her daughter. The seriousness of the situation was such that the domestic violence had already resulted in an official report. Some time ago, Amelia had found it necessary to go to the public security police to file a formal complaint for assault against Diana. The teacher lived in a constant state of anxiety and seemed to sense that her life was in danger. So much so that in one of her many conversations with her friend, Amelia even said that if anything ever happened to her, it was most likely that her daughter and son-in-law would be responsible. The discovery of Amelia's lifeless body changed the course of the investigation. Obviously, a random kidnapping or a voluntary disappearance rarely ends with a charred body dozens of kilometers away from where the victim was last seen. Everything pointed to someone wanting to destroy any evidence, to erase the trace of what had really happened to Amelia Fialho. At this point, the police already saw Diana and Yuri as suspects. Not only for the obvious reason that they were the last people who had seen Amelia alive, but also because several things surrounding that disappearance just didn't add up. But there was more. The investigators discovered that Amelia owned numerous properties like a duplex apartment in Montijo, a rented house and a vacation home, 2 cars and several savings accounts with significant funds, as well as life insurance policies. Assets in which she had invested her savings from decades and decades of working as a teacher. By the time Amelia adopted Diana, she had named Casa do Gaiato, an international network of shelters for vulnerable children, orphans, or those at risk of social exclusion. But in 2013, Amelia changed that will to make her daughter, who was then 18 years old, her heir. And this was doubly interesting. Not only because Diana and her husband were living off Amelia, despite being two fully grown adults perfectly capable of working, but also because when the couple went to the police station to report Amelia's disappearance, accompanied by a friend of Amelia, the first thing that worried Yuri was not finding his mother-in-law. According to that friend, as soon as they left the police station, Yuri said that if Amelia had really disappeared, how were they going to access her things now? Those statements turned out to be quite suspicious, first of all, because at that moment there was no clear reason to assume that Amelia was dead. At that time, the case was a disappearance case, not a murder, and on top of that, Diana's behavior was strange. Although, in circumstances like these, each person can react differently. Diana seemed to be too calm and serene for someone who claimed to be so worried about her mother's whereabouts. When we talk about murder investigations, it's not uncommon for victims to have some kind of close relationship with their killers. That's why many times a person's friends, family, and loved ones are often among the first suspects. And this situation is what helped the case get solved fairly quickly. After the body was found on September 5th, the judicial police took just 36 hours to get to the truth. A thorough search of the Fialho residence was enough to find sufficient evidence against Diana and Yuri. First, the officers found several items of clothing belonging to the couple, which gave off a strong smell of bleach. This suggested that it was due to a hasty attempt to remove traces of blood, especially because when they exposed these clothes to chemical reagents, the presence of human blood was confirmed. When thoroughly searching the rooms, the investigators discovered Amelia's identification documents, which were meticulously wrapped in toilet paper and hidden in the toilet tank. Something that didn't make sense, since if Amelia had really walked out that Saturday night, it didn't make sense that her essential IDs were still in the house and, moreover, were hidden. The key evidence was found in the garage, and when the forensic experts inspected the trunk of the family's vehicle, they detected a large concentration of the victim's human blood. The stains were not visible. They had been carefully washed, but when exposed to the reagents, there was no doubt that the body had been transported in that car. In Amelia's room, a blood stain was found that reached all the way to the ceiling, and the killers either hadn't seen it or hadn't been able to clean it. The experts also found traces of blood on the railing of the house and even on a sewing machine. The authorities also noticed a striking detail. The couple's phones had been turned off, precisely during the time when it is believed they got rid of the body. And as if that weren't enough, it was found in the couple's search history that one of them had searched if a turned-off device could be located, because someone who was supposedly desperately waiting for their mother's return would make sure to completely disconnect from the outside world. In light of this evidence, a judicial police officer proceeded with the formal arrest of the couple on Friday, September 7, 2018. And it was under that intense pressure that Yuri Mata completely broke down and confessed everything. Yuri's detailed statement to the inspectors made it possible to accurately reconstruct everything that had happened that night. The motive for the murder had been money. Neither Yuri nor Diana were willing to work. During the last few years, the couple had lived off Amelia's money, and despite the tensions, she refused to completely cut off contact with her daughter. Amelia even went so far as to threaten Diana with removing her from her will. And this threat was already enough to suspect Diana and also her boyfriend, or rather her husband. The investigation also confirmed that it wasn't a fit of rage, but rather that this had been planned for at least 3 months before the fateful day arrived. And all of this could be seen in the couple's history. The couple's history on their mobile phones, on their computers. All of this revealed that it had been organized. They had used the internet and had gone to the location. Also to remote areas in the Caña and Pegos area, exactly where the body would later be found as well. They also searched for which medications could be used to put a person into a deep sleep. The plan was taking shape and could be verified with all these details. They were also able to confirm that on September 1st, this couple crushed a large dose of powerful psychiatric drugs, including strong sleep aids and antidepressants. They put this powder into the water bottle that Amelia drank from every night before going to sleep. And the drugs, according to the authorities, worked perfectly. Amelia collapsed into a deep unconscious state onto a blanket on her bedroom floor, very close to where her pet slept. Then Diana and Yuri entered the room. They were armed with a hammer and proceeded to strike her directly on the skull until they ended her life. It should also be mentioned that the hammer was never found, as well as Yuri's confession and the pattern of bloodstains found in the house. We're talking about stains that even reached the ceiling. I don't know if you remember, but they were consistent with someone who had been repeatedly struck with a blunt object, such as a hammer. In his statement, Yuri admitted to hitting his mother-in-law with a hammer, but claimed that it was Diana who delivered the final blows when he lost his nerve. He always maintained that his wife was the one who organized and carried out this crime. But Diana, by contrast, told a different story. She said that when she entered the room, her mother was already dead, and seeing this made her feel completely desperate. And she was afraid that Yuri might be capable of doing something similar to her, and that's why she ended up helping him get rid of the body. According to Yuri's confession after this, the couple wrapped the corpse in a blanket. They used the elevator of the residential building in the early hours of the morning to avoid running into any neighbors, and took the body down to the underground garage. Once there, they placed the body in the trunk of the vehicle or luggage compartment and used secondary roads heading toward PGOS, a rural area, and significantly more remote to minimize the chances of running into police patrols at that time of night. And during the journey, they made a strategic stop at a local service station. And to avoid raising suspicion because of the recording system at this service station or gas station, what they did was park the vehicle as far away as possible and entered the place separately, as if they didn't know each other. Yuri bought a 5-liter plastic can, filled it with gasoline directly from the pump, and paid with his card. Minutes later, Diana went in separately to buy a lighter, testing the flame just as she left the establishment. This is absolutely clear because the security cameras at the establishment caught her while she was testing the lighter. With the fuel and the lighter already in the couple's possession, they resumed their journey toward the exact coordinates, which they had already checked beforehand using digital maps on their phones. They stopped at kilometer 38.5 on National Road 4, a dark spot surrounded by farmland where visibility was practically zero. Once the car was parked on the dirt road, both of them got out of the vehicle, opened the trunk, and carried Amelia's body, which was still wrapped in a blanket. They carried it several meters across the plowed field, before laying it down in an area of low vegetation. And the rest is obvious. They soaked the body with gasoline, set it on fire hoping the flames would eliminate any evidence. As soon as the flames started to spread, the couple immediately left the place, returned to the vehicle, and began the trip back to Montijo. It is also important to note that immediately afterward, while they were crossing the Vasco da Gama bridge, late at night, Diana and Yuri threw out the window into the deep waters of the Tagus River. The hammer used as the murder weapon, as well as Amelia's cell phone and Amelia's reading glasses. The police authorities coordinated search teams in the river to try to recover this evidence, but the currents and the depth of the river made it impossible to retrieve any of these objects. The judicial process began in 2019 at the Almada court and attracted massive media attention throughout Portugal. Yuri's lawyers argued before the court that the detailed confession the young man gave on September 7, 2018 should be declared null and void. Because supposedly, during this interrogation, a defense attorney was not present, and according to his version, the inspectors had psychologically pressured the accused to obtain details about the route and the mechanics of the crime. For her part, Diana Fialho's strategy was to maintain a cold silence during most of the process, or when she felt cornered, to directly blame her husband for having planned and carried out the physical attack against Amelia. The defense tried to portray her as a fearful bystander who acted under coercion, even though the security camera footage showed her calmly testing the lighter. However, the public prosecutor's office had already anticipated these moves and shored up its case by presenting a large amount of evidence. There were bloodstains in the house, on the clothes, her internet searches, security camera footage at the service station, the gas station, and more. The autopsy reports confirmed, despite the charred state of the body, the presence of powerful sedatives in the victim's tissue, and massive skull fractures, consistent with blows from a hammer, which matched what Yuri had said about how it all happened. Diana Fialho was sentenced to 24 years in prison. The court gave her one of the highest sentences under Portuguese law, where the absolute maximum is 25 years. Punishing not only the aggravated homicide, but also the aggravating factor of parricide due to the adoptive relationship and the subsequent desecration of the corpse. Meanwhile, Yuri Mata was sentenced to 23 years in prison as a co-perpetrator of the murder and for the crimes of concealment and destruction of evidence. The judge rejected all mitigating factors of remorse that his defense tried to argue at the end of the trial. In addition to the prison sentences, the court ordered the total loss of any inheritance rights over Amelia Fialho's assets, ensuring that the financial motive behind the crime became the reason for his absolute downfall. Diana Fialho even gave an interview while already in prison, where she said she felt great pain over the loss of her mother, who was the only person she could count on and who always loved her. In this interview, she said that her marriage to Yuri had already ended after everything that happened, and that they had even started divorce proceedings. The story of Amelia Fialho became etched into Europe's true crime history as one of the most shocking examples of how far ambition and lack of human empathy can go. A heartbreaking story where what began as the noble wish of a single teacher to provide a home, education, and love to a 9-year-old girl ended 14 years later in a vacant lot in Pagos, with a woman who ended up being betrayed by someone she had chosen to love deeply, selflessly, and unconditionally. The case forced the Montijo community and Portuguese society to reflect on the alarming signs of domestic violence that are often normalized or ignored as mere arguments over money. Today, Diana and Yuri are serving their sentences in separate prisons, while the memory of Amelia Fialho, a teacher at Jorge Peixinho School, remains alive in the memories of her students and colleagues. Not because of the tragic end that was imposed on her, but because of the decades she dedicated to teaching and serving her community. And you, what do you think? Do you believe it was Diana who planned everything, or do you believe her version that it was her husband who attacked her mother, and that she, only out of fear, decided to help him get rid of the body? I feel that the official version is that the daughter, yes, the daughter is the one to blame, but I want to read your thoughts in the comments. That's it for today's case. I look forward to your comments below, and with that, we'll meet again in the next story.